LaTosha, I want to kick it off with you. You're on the ground, moving in communities all over this country. And so I'm curious, what's your consensus about engagement when it comes to the people? Are they hype and ready once again to battle voter suppression and hit the polls? Or will it take some convincing from community validators to get people engaged? And I just want to point out that someone tweeted me this morning and said it's really not about enthusiasm when it comes to voting. It's about motivation. So I'm curious your thoughts on that as well.
Yeah, you know, the saying hype, they're not hype, but what they are is they're pissed off. That what we're seeing is that we're seeing young voters who are extremely frustrated with what is happening, from gas prices to actually from seeing the Republicans attack from voter suppression across the board. And so I do think that the tweet that you received today, that encapsulates that at the end of the day, people are frustrated, and frustration can actually lead to motivation. You know, I think the Republicans, as they always do, I think this time they went too far, that this was an election cycle. This is a midterm election that normally they would be going in with an advantage. I actually believe that they're going in with a disadvantage. And young voters, I think, they're going to make the difference in this next election cycle. We're at the beginning, I believe, of a new 40-year political cycle, where you're going to see younger voters. They're more informed. Some of them are informed, with the correct information because of social media platforms. Some of them are getting information that is not correct, but they're more informed, which means they're more engaged. And I think they're going to be more engaged this election cycle.
You know, Lynn, I think LaTosha makes a good point, because social media does play such a big role, particularly when it comes to young constituents, which is why it's so disheartening that so many members of the API community have not been contacted by either political party. The same can be said for Latino voters, and certainly this extends to indigenous voters as well, and certainly Black voters have our own collective issues. But it is a frustrating process that I see, that there still seems to be this effort to censor white voices, and a lot of conservative white voices even, that quite frankly have left the Democratic Party a long time ago. What do you make of AAPI voters continuing to be ignored by both parties?
I mean, Tiffany, I'm not surprised. I'm not. And we did a poll, this was late in 2021, where I think it was a little over 2/3 of young Asian American voters still had not been contacted by a political party, political campaign, a candidate, an organization to get involved. Right. And I think we're starting to see a little bit of a shift here, though. I mean, campaigns, donors, they need to recognize that Asian American voters, they're not just in California, they're not just in New York City. We are everywhere. We're in the Midwest. We're in southern states like here in Texas, in North Carolina. I mean, we saw in Georgia in 2020, again in 2021, where historical API turnout helped flip a congressional district from red to blue, again in 2020. Right. And so I think we're seeing this unprecedented, reports on anti-Asian violence, hate crimes. Members of our community strongly feel like our own existence is political. And I think the challenge here is that with AAPI, with Asian American Pacific Islanders as a voting electorate, I mean, we may only be 3, 4, maybe 5% of the state's voting electorate. And I promise y'all, these numbers are going to continue to grow. But that's where the difference in a win or a loss in November comes into play. Yes.
You make such a good point. Races are often won on the margins. And so when you ignore those communities, not only are you invalidating those people's presence and importance in this country just as human beings, but as political operatives, they are voters. And this is something that they have to do better. You make a good point about the API community. And Aaron, one thing that I've noticed is when people are running for office who look like you and can reflect your interests, voter participation increases and people are more likely to pay attention. There's a record number of women running for office, women of color in particular, 167 Black women, 95 Latina women, 36 women from the AAPI community. You just wrote a piece talking about what Vice President Harris is doing on the campaign trail this cycle. I'm curious what you see her role being in midterms and how impactful she might be, considering that the administration has had some wins this morning, and she represents 2 constituencies, Black voters as well as AAPI.
Yeah, absolutely, Tiffany. And thanks so much for mentioning the piece. Look, happy Renaissance weekend. Let me start by that. With that,
absolutely, Aaron.
Also, if you're watching and happened to win the Mega Millions jackpot last night, my DMs are wide open. But listen, Vice President President Harris, seriously, she is emerging as a likely campaign surrogate, for whom we don't exactly know yet. But she told me when I was with her out in Battleground, Florida earlier this month that she does plan on traveling. And she talked about the importance of building the kinds of coalitions that were similar to the ones that delivered victories for Democrats in 2020, the ones that Lynn was just alluding to. And that's going to mean drumming up enthusiasm, getting voters motivated to actually turn out. Now, can they do that with 101 days left to go? I'm not sure, but I do think that it is notable that this is happening already this summer and not after Labor Day, particularly to these key groups, which is normally the case, and a sign that Democrats realize that they are needing to value these voters much more for their input and not just their output. I also want to say the big lie is on the ballot in states across the country, right, with election deniers winning primaries in many states. But are Republicans going to reject those voters? I mean, those candidates in November? Will the insurrection have an impact on what they decide to do at the ballot box? Or will those 1-6 hearings motivate Democrats, for example, to show up to defeat those Republican candidates who are continuing to insist that the 2020 election was rigged despite the overwhelming evidence that we know it was not?
I think that's such an important question, Aaron, because the GOP really, we have to stop separating the GOP from right-wing extremists. I mean, the party has morphed into one. And so if you have millions of voters showing up, validating the big lie and re-electing people who will continue to support Trumpism, that will certainly be a problem. LaTosha, I want you to take a listen. My amazing colleague, Tremaine Lee, he was down in our collective neck of the woods, me, Aaron, and LaTosha, all Atlanta folks. Tremaine was on Morehouse's campus talking to young black men down there, and he asked them what issues matter to them. Take a listen to one person he talked to, and I'll ask you about it on the other side.
What issues matter most to you? Let's start with you.
For me, I definitely think about immigration and housing insecurity, especially when you look at a city like Atlanta that has so many homeless people and so many people moving into the city, but there's not enough affordable homes.
I agree wholeheartedly. For me, the biggest thing that's on my mind is Roe v. Wade and how it's been recently overturned and how that comes to affect future generations, as well as wrongly imprisoned and mass incarceration.
Yeah, absolutely. So my biggest policy issues in this upcoming election cycle would be healthcare and criminal justice reform.
The Clark Atlanta University there. But you see, LaTosha, that these young voters, they are engaged. They know what's happening. I'm curious your thoughts, because there are some people, and I also want to say Vice President Harris has made black voters a center focal point of hers. Erin points out in her piece that she spoke at the Boulé with the AKAs, the NAACP conference, Essence. And so at the Atlanta University Center, these young voters are paying attention. However, there's some challenges in Atlanta with Stacey Abrams kind of polling behind Brian Kemp and Senator Ralph Warnock polling slightly ahead of Herschel Walker. What do you make of that divide, especially when it comes to the younger voters?
I think that part of what we're going to have to see, and I'm glad that one of the voters brought it up, was around criminal justice reform. I do have a lesson around what I think is the poison pill for the Democrats. Quite frankly, I think that the Democrats could keep the Senate. There is going to be a tough uphill battle with the House. But let me tell you what I think the poison pill. The poison pill is going to be centered around criminal justice reform. We're actually seeing Democrats lead, like Spanberger, who is a Democrat, to actually lead on this crime bill, which is basically crime bill, the 1994 crime bill 2.0. That is literally suggesting that there's a triple. That you triple the amount of money for $1 billion for police. Police investments, when we saw the largest uprising ever in the history of this country, in the George Floyd uprising that was propelled and led by young people, they expect, when we're talking to young folks across the board, we're going to see that everywhere. Across the board, those are consistent issues: economic security, criminal justice reform, and really how are we going to deal with housing and the rising cost of living. Those are going to be critical issues. I believe in the state of Georgia, what you're going to see is you're going to see this coalition. I think that Stacey has shown that her coalition, she has the ability to appeal to young voters at a much, much greater rate than Brian Kemp, and that she has an agenda that supports that. So I do think that young voters are going to make the difference, not only in Georgia, but throughout the nation. But I also think that the Democrats have to be very careful that they are speaking to the issues of young people, and they're not jumping on this bandwagon, as they always do, to abandon the base so that they can solidify white voters who have not showed up for them for 25 years.
Absolutely. And Lynn, you know, there are some key Senate races. I'm certainly watching what's going to happen in Florida with Congresswoman Val Demings squaring off with Marco Rubio, who's essentially a Trump acolyte. You've got Cheryl Beasley in North Carolina. When it comes to diversity in the Senate, what's your prediction? Will the Democrats keep the House and the Senate? Will we see some more diversity in the Senate? What say you?
Ooh. I got to be hopeful, Tiffany. I got to say we're going to see some more diversity. But I will say, and especially with a candidate like Val Demings, everyone needs to be watching how she's campaigning on the ground. And when we talk specifically with young voters, they are doing everything that I think is correct. They have a young team that is leading a lot of their efforts. They're allowing the narrative and storytelling to be the top priority in the campaign. And I think specifically with young voters in a state like Florida, they don't want to hear any more theory. They don't want to hear any more plans. If you're asking for their vote, you're asking for their donation, they need to hear a clear plan. And I really do believe that in these key Senate races, we're starting to see a lot of that. And again, going back to young voters, they want to see accountability, right? Their sense of civic duty is so much more than just casting their ballot in November. They want to see accountability, and they want to see these politicians, these candidates, keeping their promises.
Yeah. Aaron, we're out of time, so a quick yes or no from you. Will we see a black woman in the Senate this fall?
I think that's absolutely going to depend on whether these coalitions are able to elect them. But there's certainly no shortage of candidates on the ballot heading to November who are qualified to possibly make that happen again.
All right, well, we'll keep our eyes on it. So thank you so much, Lynn Wynn, for being here. And to the Machete members, LaTosha Brown and Aaron Haynes. Happy Renaissance weekend to all three of you ladies.